Welcome back to another Swordmaster Publications presentation. I'm Rennie Lawrence, and today we're going to be studying Deuteronomy chapter 15. A pretty easygoing chapter as far as these things go. It's not going to be as controversial for some. There might be a few questions about the whole servant thing, but this should be a pretty easy one for a lot of people to swallow. So, not going to worry too much about really drawing things out here and trying to give us a good look at some of those controversies because I just don't think they're in this particular chapter. So do thank you for tuning in, and we're gonna go ahead and get started. Deuteronomy chapter 15 and verse 1. At the end of every 7 years, you shall make a release. So this is what they call a Sabbath year. The land was supposed to rest. We talked about the idea of Jubilee, but that's 50 years. This is a 7 year thing, and they were not only supposed to let the land rest every 7 years, but you also have this release here of servants, and we're going to see that there's some specifics that they had to follow. One minor alleged contradiction that we'll deal with here in a moment. But anyway, the 7 years, every 7 years, they are supposed to make a release. And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lends anything to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called Jehovah's release. Right? So that's what they're going to call it. They're going to call it Jehovah's release. So if you lend something, if you lend money or property of any kind, first of all, private property, definitely part of the biblical teaching here. But if you lend anything to your neighbor, your brother, like a relative, you're going to release it in the seventh year. All right, and that's people were aware of this, and should this is part of this is about preparation and knowing what is coming up. But you also have this idea that God says, if you know that this seventh year is coming up, you don't withhold this. You lend to somebody who is in need. It says you can't exact. You can't say, hey, you borrowed $100 from me. Uh, the seventh year is coming up. I need you to pay me back before the seventh year is coming up. No, if you've set up like a payment plan or you've lent it to them or whatever, you can't demand it of them if they're not able to pay or whatever uh, before that seventh year is up. You can't exact it. Now, the other part of this is in verse 3 of a foreigner, somebody who is not, remember there's three classes of people really. There's the Hebrew people, the Israelites. There are the sojourners. There are the foreigners that have kind of thrown their lot in with Israel, and they're proselytizing um, and kind of becoming part of Israel, even though they aren't descended from Abraham. And then there's the foreigner, the person who is outside of, they may come to visit, they may come to trade, do business with Israel, but they are not going to stay and they're not trying to be a part of Israel. And so those are the three different kinds of people here. And so uh, Moses says, of a foreigner, you may exact it again. In other words, um, you can continue to make them pay. This rule only applies to those who are of the Israelite nation or are these sojourners or whatever that are kind of part of the nation here. But foreigners, you if you lent them money, you absolutely need to get that back from them. Usury, or what we call interest, is allowed to be charged to foreigners. Um, but that which is thine, with whatever is yours that your brother has, um, you'll release it. You'll let it go. You forgive the debt. And part of this is because of the bounty that God gives. God is going to bless them with enough income in terms of their cattle and their growing things, all of the things that they need to live. God is going to bless them with so much abundance that if you do have somebody who's poor or whatever and in need, it is not going to hurt you at all to lend that to them and then never require payment. And I've seen this happen in my lifetime many times where there will be people that are well-to-do, and uh, they'll lend money at the beginning. It's an agreement. Okay, I'm going to lend you $100, or I'm going to lend you $1,000 or whatever. Um, and then they set a time period for this. And then the person who borrowed the money comes to them and says, "Hey, I was able to get everything in order. I'm here to pay you back." And they say, "Don't even worry about it." And that's kind of the mindset that God is trying to teach to these people here is, look, you're going to be in such abundance that if you lend something to somebody and they haven't paid it back in full by the seventh year, just let it go. It's not like you're going to be starving or anything like that. It's not like you're going to be needing that you lend out to them. God says, basically, God says, whatever you lend to them, if they haven't paid you back in 7 years, I'm going to take care of it for you. And so that's the other part of this is teaching about the forgiveness of debts. It's trying to train them to forgive debts. What does Jesus in the model prayer say? Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. That's not just a random thing that Jesus is bringing in as brand new under the law of Christ. This is actually something that has been going on now for 1500 years. And so again, we see this idea of Israel as a blessing and as a model for the surrounding nations. Um, think about a nation that is serving God, that has turned to God. And I'm not talking about a quote unquote Christian nation, because there's only one Christian nation, and that's the church. But think of a nation who founds its constitution, its principles on what we read here. And America is that way to an extent. Our constitution is on some very fundamental biblical principles. But even if we were to go a bit farther, and if we were to maintain a biblical morality as a nation, how hard would it be for us to deal with our poor and to deal with our homeless and the people who are hungry and the orphans and all of those who are in need in this particular way? They're Americans, and we could, um, lend them the money they needed to get started in their own, and then seventh year, if they haven't fully paid it back, fine, let it go. And it's just a very powerful lesson on both the abundance that comes with doing things God's way, and that God pays for our debts, that we should forgive people of their debts to us, because God is the one that actually is going to handle that debt. He's going to be the one to forgive. Christ handled our sin debt on the cross. And so when we talk about those who sin against us, now I've got a whole lesson on forgiveness and the nature of forgiveness, and the need for repentance, and how just it is to forgive a certain way. We have to forgive the way that God has modeled for us to forgive. But in terms of monetary property and the things that we own physically in this life, he's setting up a powerful, powerful lesson. We even have in the New Testament the story of a man who owed a whole lot of money. I don't remember the exact number, but he goes to the Lord and he says, I can't repay it. There's just no way for me to repay it. And the Lord says, you know what? I forgive you of the debt. And, big, big, huge debt, whatever thousands of dollars it equates to in American dollars or whatever. And then the guy turns around, right around, and he has a lesser servant who owes him a pittance, like a day's wage or something like that. And in the same scenario happens, the lesser servant looks to the guy who's kind of higher up in the bureaucracy, and says, I can't pay the debt. I have to put food on the table. I have to pay rent or whatever. He just doesn't have the capacity to pay back this pittance that he borrowed. And the unjust servant throws his fellow servant into jail to pay off the debt. Well, then the Lord hears about how that goes down and ends up uh, making the guy that was unjust pay for it anyway. And so you have this idea of God is going to provide. God will provide everything that you need. In terms of Israel, that meant physical things. That He was going to provide abundance of family, abundance of cattle, abundance of plants, everything that you needed to live. God was going to provide that, and above what you would ever need to survive. And so go ahead and lend that out. And if they can't pay it all back by the seventh year, just let it go. God's got it covered. So I love this lesson. And then he says, that which is in your brother's hand, or that which is yours, which is in your brother's hand, just let it go. Save, now pay attention here, save when there shall be no poor among you. So if there's ever a time when there's no poor among you, then you can go ahead and hold that debt to your brother. Okay, because whatever. Now here's the the reason that this is a contradiction. If there are no poor, if people are if there's nobody in Israel who doesn't have the things that they need, why would they be borrowing from anybody? Okay, but then further on, you're going to see uh, that God is kind of he's kind of saying something that is more of a teaching tool, not a reality. He's like, okay, so if there's ever a time when there's not poor among you, but later on he's going to say, but the poor are always going to be among you. So in other words, always do this. It's not a contradiction. It's just God saying that, think about how much you're going to be blessed with, and then think about the state of humanity. There's always going to be times when an individual is down on their luck. Things happen either by their choice or without their choice, natural disasters or something, just the state of entropy itself, where they end up poor, they lose everything. Maybe they did something wrong. Maybe they made evil choices or whatever, but then they repented and they turned around, but they had lost everything because of those wrong choices. And now they're trying to get back. They've already gone to the priest and done all they needed to get back good with God, and they're poor and they need help to get back on their feet. So there's a whole kinds of reasons why there was going to be poor, and there was always going to be poor. In fact, Jesus, even during his time, they uh, when Mary anointed him with the very expensive oil, and the disciples were upset and said, Judas, of course, was thinking about money because he was getting a little bit of graft there, but he brings it up. He says, that could have been sold and given to the poor, is his argument. And Jesus said, you've always got the poor with you, but I'm not always going to be with you, talking about that he was about to be crucified. And so the idea that the poor are a constant thing, sometimes people are poor, and it's because they don't necessarily have the capacity um, to do what is necessary to not be poor anymore. My wife has done some work here locally, and has done this for a number of years, where she'll go out and she will, I'll stay home and watch the kids, and she'll go out because it's not really safe to take the kids to this kind of stuff. But she'll help with the homeless, trying to find food and shelter, a place to stay. And she says a lot of those people are mentally incapacitated to an extent where it's very difficult, if not impossible, for them to hold down a solid job. And because of those mental struggles that they have, whether it be like emotional, a lot of veterans are in this kind of state. And I'm not saying generally speaking, but of the homeless, a lot of the homeless are veterans who are dealing with severe mental struggles that it's just almost impossible for them to hold down a job, or other people are hurting and stuff. So there's some people who are poor because they're not capable of taking care of themselves for one reason or another. So we're always going to have the poor with us. And part of what God is doing here with Israel, and of course we see this also in the New Testament, is how do we take care of those people? How do we take care of the homeless and the hungry and whatever? And this is God providing for them. And how different is this than the surrounding nations, the nations that were around Israel, who were um, more along the lines of, well, if you can't keep up, then too bad for you. And they were very self-oriented, and they were very focused on, uh, you know, I'm going to succeed at the cost of everyone else. Whereas here, God is saying, I'm going to help you succeed, and you're going to take care of those who can't. That's a wholly different picture of how to treat your fellow man. And in this, there is a lesson to these other nations. And this is how part of how Israel is a blessing to these other nations, is showing them a better way to live. Okay, so it says, save when there shall be no poor among you, which never happens according to God. For Jehovah shall greatly bless you in the land which Jehovah your God has given you for an inheritance to possess it. Only if you carefully hearken unto the voice of Jehovah your God, to observe to do all these commandments which I command you this day. So here Moses is writing the book of Deuteronomy, and he's talking about writing these commandments, and they have to keep these commandments. And if they listen and do what Moses is commanding them to do, then God is going to continue to greatly bless them in this land of inheritance that he's given them. All right? If they stop doing that, then the whole system falls apart. I'm reminded of Ben Franklin, who talked about that our Constitution, our free nation, was only good if we remained a moral people, and if we got away from that morality, which we obviously have, then his quote was that we would be more in need of masters. Um, Otherwise, the whole system just comes apart at the seams. God is providing this standard of morality for them to live by. This is what is good to do. And as long as they listened to him and did what he says, then they would be blessed. I would argue that a part of this is a supernatural blessing, keeping away disease, people living to their ripe old age and not getting sick. A lot of that is God directly taking care of them, but also a lot of this is just providence. If we do things God's way, even today, when we're at an age where miracles are not performed and God is not directly um, stirring the pot the way he did in the first century and in the time of Israel, when things are relying on God's providence, doing things God's way is a way for things to take care of themselves. If you act the way that God has called for a Christian to act, providentially, you are going to be blessed because people are going to look at you a certain way and they're going to treat you a certain way because they know your character. They understand, that person is living as a Christian. They don't just claim to be a Christian, they're living as a Christian. And uh, God's providence tends to take care of you. Consider the lilies of the field and the sparrows, and God takes care of them. How much more is he going to take care of our needs? But the caveat here is as long as we are hearkening unto the voice of the Lord. For Israel, that was following the law of Moses. For us today, that's following the law of Christ. Okay, and verse 6, for Jehovah your God blesses you as he promised you, and you shall lend unto many nations, but you shall not borrow. And you shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you. So this is a command here. This is a powerful, powerful command. If you are hearkening unto the voice of Jehovah, one of the things that you have to do is you can lend to other nations. God says if you want to lend out some money to other nations, perfectly fine. Charge them usury, that's fine. But you cannot borrow from other nations. Why? Because when you borrow from those other nations, you become beholden to those nations. and they have kind of a lead on you, like you would tie a lead to a cow or a donkey or something, that they can kind of rein you in. We talk about the elders, the qualifications for elders of a congregation. They can't have that hook in them of something worldly that draws them away and could be used to control them in their capacity as the leader of the congregation. Same thing here. Israel was not to lend to, I mean, not to borrow from other nations, because then they could be controlled by that other nation. They can lend it, and God's like, if you want to reign over other nations, which they were going to do, remember the whole Jacob and Esau thing. Um, they could totally do that, but they should not subject themselves to other nations uh, to be ruled over, which they ended up doing a number of times, and God was not pleased with them for that. In fact, He had some pretty strong words when they subjected themselves to other rulers. He called them prostitutes for doing that. And a lot of people will try to say, well, it was only in terms of worshiping their false gods. It was more than that. It was economic as well. And here's part of God preparing them, saying, don't ever do this. Don't ever borrow money from them, and don't subject yourself to the rule of foreign nations. And if they did, which they did, just read Ezekiel, um, read Isaiah, then God says, you're basically married to me, and for you to go to these other nations is basically you prostituting yourself out for money. It's not just that Israel was committing adultery, which would have been them worshiping the false gods, but them prostituting themselves out. They were going after these other gods of these other nations for money, and that's why he calls them prostitutes, or if you're reading the King James, he calls them whores. And that's why when we get into books like Revelation, and you see the whore of Babylon in Revelation 17, that's absolutely physical Jerusalem, representative of the Jews, because of commands like this right here, that they were not supposed to do that. And that's exactly what Herod did. Herod the Great was in with the Caesars, and subjected himself to the Caesars, and became one of the 10 provinces under Rome, and did not trust in God at all. So, um, verse 7, if there be among you a poor man of one of your brethren within any of your gates in your land, which Jehovah has given you, then shall uh, not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your poor brother, but you shall open your hand wide unto him, and shall surely lend him sufficient for his need in that which he wants. Okay, so if you see somebody that's poor, don't don't shut up against that person. Don't say, well, he got himself there, or if I give him money, he's just going to go buy booze, or any of the things. If you see somebody that is homeless, according to the law of Moses, this person if he was your brother, if he was a fellow Hebrew, fellow descendant of Abraham, or he was one of the proselytes, you had to take care of him, make sure he was taken care of, um, and don't shut your hand up against him, because remember, God's going to provide everything that you need, and abundantly, so that you have more than enough. Um, I would argue here, and my brother likes to make this argument all the time. He's a financial advisor. Um, it is not a sin to be rich. In fact, people who are wealthy and are Christians are able to do more good than a Christian who is poor, in terms of uh, being able to help. Now, I'm not saying that poor Christians can't help people. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that in this kind of situation, wealthy Christians are able to do more because they have more. In their abundance, they are empowered to do service to those who are homeless or hungry, or uh, in need of something, more than somebody like me. I don't. I mean, we're a single income household and stuff, and we help where we can. But um, somebody who is a lot more wealthy than I am is capable of doing a lot more, by choice with that wealth. And um, I think that's a powerful lesson again that God is teaching here. Not only is it not sinful to be wealthy, to be rich, but that when you are wealthy, when you are rich, how much power do you have to help those who aren't? That God has blessed you with all of this and will continue to bless you, and it is a great thing for you to use a portion of that to help. And we see this in Acts chapter 5. There was a great need. Everybody was in Jerusalem and they didn't want to leave. And so the Christians in the area were selling off all the stuff that they had. And they were giving very cheerfully, very willingly to supply the need of the time. And then, of course, there's the story of Ananias and Sapphira. They didn't have to sell their property. God said it was yours. You can do it as you want. Be a cheerful giver. But you don't have to lie about it. And so they could have just kept their property and done nothing, and they would have been fine. But they sold their property and only gave a portion of it, and then lied about it, and that's where they got into trouble. But God says, "I've given you abundantly. You're going to be wealthy. Out of that abundance, help those who are poor, for whatever reason that they're poor. Help them out." Okay. And then it says in verse 9, because humans we can think this way. Beware that there be not a thought in your wicked heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of release, is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry out unto Jehovah against you, and it be a sin unto you. So Moses here is even saying, if you see that seventh year, that year of release, or Jehovah's release coming, and you see a poor person, don't think in your heart, because it's wicked to do so. Don't think in your heart, well, I really don't want to lend to this person right now because I know that I'm not going to get this back, because I know the year of release is coming. So what I'm going to do is just kind of look the other way, and I'm not going to help this person. And after the year of release comes, then I can start helping people again. God through Moses is saying, don't you dare do that. You help even knowing that you're not going to get even a dime of that back, because it's wicked. It says, don't let the thought come into your wicked heart. Now, some people will come to this verse and say, see, the heart is wicked. And they'll go to Jeremiah 17:9 and say, look, the heart is wicked. And they'll try to take these out of context and say that man's heart is wicked and wholly so, and that we are incapable of doing good except for what good God does through us. God has to come down and personally tweak our hearts to get us to do good. That's not what this is saying at all. Moses is even given the warning here, beware that you don't think this way. In giving the warning, he is implying that it is our choice. But he says, don't let this kind of thinking come into your heart, because then you have a wicked heart if this is the way that you think. That's the proper way to frame this. The proper way to understand this is that if you are worried more about getting your money back or your property back than helping somebody who is poor, then your heart is wicked for doing that. That's what this is meaning here. It says, you shall surely give him, and your heart shall not be grieved. In other words, be a cheerful giver. Be glad to be able to help somebody when you give unto him, because that for this thing Jehovah your God shall bless you in all your works and in all that you put your hand to do. Be grateful that you have the opportunity to help somebody. And if this is your mindset, obviously you don't have a wicked heart if this is the way you view things. If you give that way, then God is going to give you even more. He's going to bless you abundantly for doing things his way. Now, this is not that prosperity gospel type stuff. Remember, this is Israel. This is a physical nation. This is not a promise that God gives us under the New Testament. Our blessings are spiritual for the most part under the New Testament. Okay, so touching the screen and giving $10,000 to Joel Osteen or some of these guys they're not framing this properly. This is the Old Testament, and the way that God is talking about here is that supernatural abundance that he gave to Israel as long as they were obedient, because he needed to have them preserved as that vehicle for fulfilling the promise to Abraham. Okay, it's different under the New Testament. So understand that. And then remember up above, he said, unless there's no poor among you, but now look at verse 11, for the poor shall never cease out of the land. The poor shall never cease. So that's not really a thing that's ever going to happen. And so at no time could they ever say, well, I can't give to somebody who's in need, because there's always going to be poor. And Jesus alludes to this when he says that you'll always have the poor with you. The poor shall never cease out of the land. Why? Because there's always going to be things that happen where people are down on their, what we call down on their luck, and people get to a point where they are in need. I've been there myself a couple of times. It's rough. It's hard to ask for help. But what God is saying here is, if you see somebody who needs help, you offer it to them. You give it to them. And be joyful when you do that. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open your hand wide unto your brother, to the poor, to the needy in your land. Don't be a stingy giver. Don't be somebody who gives begrudgingly. Be just as giving as you can. Fulfill their needs. Let their cup run over with abundance, the way that God has helped your cup to run over with abundance, is essentially what he's saying. And in verse 12, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, now notice that, if your brother, God talks a lot in terms of males, but he understand that that's the generic form. And if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, so who's your brother? A Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman. So all the laws that we have, like the maleness kind of being spoken about generically, is applied to both equally. There are times when there are specific genders that are applied, but most of the time the laws apply equally to everybody. One of the few exceptions I can think of is, remember when the women made a vow, if they were not married, then their father could override it. If they were married, their husband could override it. It's one of the few times where the gender specificity came in. But for the most part, these laws are for everybody equally. So if a Hebrew person is sold unto you and they serve you 6 years, in the 7th year, you let them go free. So if they have that bond, this is that kind of indentured servant idea here, this bond servant. If they serve you for 6 years, the 7th year, you let them go. And if you would send them out from you, don't let them go away empty. In other words, all right, you want to go out? Your 6 years are up. See ya. And then you just kick them out the door with the clothes on their back. God says, don't do that. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock and out of your floor, that's the threshing floor, and out of your winepress, of that wherewith Jehovah your God has blessed you, you shall give unto them. So if somebody is a servant for you for 6 years and they go out, you send them away with abundance. Give them something to establish themselves and get started on their own, so that they don't end up in this servitude state again. Okay? And you shall remember, why is God wanting to do this? You shall remember that you were a bondman, you were a servant, you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And Jehovah your God redeemed you. God paid what was necessary to get them out. He did the work that was necessary to get them out of Egypt. They didn't do anything. There's nothing that the Israelite nation did to leave Egypt. All they did was the walking. God did all of the things necessary to make sure that that leaving was successful. Okay? So he says that when your servant goes out from you, you bless them abundantly, remembering that I brought you out. I redeemed you from Egypt. And that idea of redemption there is truly powerful, because their redemption was completed when they crossed the Red Sea. water on either side and water above. They were baptized in the Red Sea and came up the other side, an independent nation, fully redeemed by God. When do we become fully redeemed by God? When we go down into the water and are immersed into Christ for the remission of our sins. That's when our sins are paid for. That's when God applies the blood to our sins, or to our soul, and washes away those sins. We are redeemed at that moment. We come up out of that water, no longer a slave to sin, but free. And anybody who says otherwise is not teaching what the Bible teaches. Um, Verse 16, and it shall be if he say unto you, I will not go away from you, because he loves you, and your house, because he is well with thee. So this is the servant. Seventh year comes around, and hey, it's the year of release. You're free to go. The servant's like, I love serving you. I love being a part of your household, your family. This is how they treated slaves. People were treated well enough that they could potentially say, I love being a part of your household. I want to be that way forever. So then you shall take an awl and thrust it through his ear into the door. Basically, they're gonna pierce their ear, and he shall be your servant forever. Forever. How long is forever? Does that mean that there's people that are still servants from 3,500 years ago? No. Forever is for the time span that is allotted. In this case, probably talking about the lifespan of the servant. Okay. Same thing with the maidservant. Also unto your maidservant you shall do likewise. If they reach that seventh year and they want to stay with you and be your servant, they want to be a part of the, you're essentially saying that this is a Hebrew person that was a bondservant was treated as part of the family. They were not treated as some of the slaves in the southern part of the United States were treated before the Civil War. They're two totally different things. They were treated as family. The law of Moses demanded that they be treated as family. And so if they decided that they loved being a part of your family that way, and they wanted to stay, then you treated them that way. You pierced their ear to show that they were with you by choice. And again, the song "Pierce My Ear" comes from this that we sing today. Pierce my ear, O Lord my God, take me to your door this day. Um, for I will serve no other God. Lord, I'm here to stay. That's the song is us saying to God, we know we could be free. We know we could walk away from you. That you've created us with free will. We can choose to go and serve whoever we want, serve self, serve sin, serve Satan, whatever we want to do. But we choose to remain your servant for the rest of our lives. That's what the song is talking about, and it's taken from this text right here. Okay. Um, and then in verse 18, it shall not seem hard unto you when you send him away from you, for he has been worth a double hired servant to thee in serving you 6 years. So if you have somebody who is a Hebrew that is an Israelite that served you for 6 years, he's worth a lot more to you because he's not a foreigner. There's a lot of things that you wouldn't have to do. You wouldn't have to teach him the laws of Moses, to the ways that they were supposed to act as a servant under the law of Moses. And there's a lot of things that were easier if you had somebody who was a Hebrew who was your bondservant. And so he's going to be worth double to you than if you were to hire a foreigner in serving those 6 years. And so if he does go away, then don't think of it as a hard thing, because now you have somebody who is a neighbor who is well off and who is only going to help the nation as a whole. And so Jehovah God shall bless you in all that you do. If you are glad the person is able to get back on their feet, for whatever reason they had to put themselves into indentured servitude, you're sending them away with abundance, and now they're going to be free and to live their life as they see fit. And God says, be glad for them. Let them go and be glad for them, and give them what they need. And God is going to bless you in all that you do if they do that. All right, and then we shift gears here towards the end, get a little bit more in terms of sacrifices and whatever when they come into land. All the firstling males that come of your herd and of your flock You shall sanctify unto Jehovah your God all of them, and you shall do no work with the firstling of your bullock, nor shear the firstling of your sheep. Okay, so when they have these firstlings, they're not supposed to do the normal labor with them. They're not supposed to shear them for clothing or anything like that. They're meant for sacrifice. You shall eat it before Jehovah your God year by year in the place which Jehovah shall choose. In other words, they were going to take it to Jerusalem and they were going to celebrate with those firstlings. So none of the firstlings of their flocks were they going to do that with. They had to take it to Jerusalem, and it was going to be part of the worship when they went to Jerusalem for these feast days. You and your household. And if there be any blemish therein, as if it be lame or blind, or have any ill blemish, you shall not sacrifice it unto Jehovah your God. So they weren't supposed to use, if a firstling came up lame, that one didn't count. But if they had a firstling that didn't have a blemish, wasn't lame or whatever, they couldn't do any work with it, couldn't shear it for wool. They were to bring it to Jerusalem and sacrifice it there and eat it as an act of worship in Jerusalem, which is the place that God was going to choose for them. You shall eat it within your gates. The unclean and the clean person shall eat it alike. That's the Jew and the Gentile. Just to be very clear about that, we've talked about the dietary laws, and clean and unclean person is a reference to Jew versus Gentile, as the roebuck and as the hart. Only you shall not eat the blood thereof, you shall pour it up on the ground as water. So that was the one thing they were not allowed to eat at all for any reason, was the blood, because the life is in the blood. Again, this is typifying the blood of Christ, who that washes us from our sin. That's the lesson there. So again, that's Deuteronomy 15. Like I said, fairly easy chapter, not a difficult one to deal with in terms of the really hard truths that some of these, like Deuteronomy 13 was. But still fascinating to study and to understand, especially as it points to those things in the New Testament and helps us understand those things in the New Testament. So I hope it's been an interesting study for you as it has been for me. And I look forward to your questions. And again, I'm Ernie Lawrence, and this has been another Swordmaster Publications presentation. You'll have a wonderful day.